it's Carly here from Tribe. Today I want to talk about some of the kind of skillful means around sharing ourselves vulnerably. And you just want to start by just kind of reiterating the importance I see for having these types of skills. And I did a Facebook Live on the vital importance of vulnerability in one of the previous lives that we did. But just like briefly recapping on that, vulnerability I think is the basis of intimacy, it's the basis of learning, it's the basis of creativity. Essentially all of these things involve taking a risk somehow, putting ourselves on the line in some way. It might be sharing our creative ideas or admitting our mistakes, and owning our mistakes, or sharing truths about ourselves. And as such, like the skills around how to do that become really, really important. So vulnerability, kind of by definition, is this place where we could get hurt somehow. And as such, sharing our vulnerability entails taking a risk in some form. So I think the first kind of thing to be aware of, and it's kind of this essential paradox around sharing ourselves vulnerably, is that it's like checking if we feel safe enough to take a risk or not. And the paradox here is that if we feel trust with somebody, we feel a sense that they're not going to judge us and they're going to accept us in the vulnerability that we share, then we feel like safe enough to take this risk. At the same time though, to develop that sense of trust and safety requires us to take a risk, because otherwise how do we know that we can trust that person? They have to actually like earn our trust somehow in the first place. So there's like this kind of paradox of, I have to take the risk to develop the trust, but I need to have the trust to take the risk. And so I want to kind of come at like knowing how to share ourselves vulnerably from both of those angles, right? So that the first angle of like taking the risk to start with, I think is quite important. How can we like take small risks to test the waters with somebody, to test out if we can trust that they're going to hold our vulnerability with kind of the respect that will have us feel safe enough to share. And I think this is particularly true for when we're engaging with new relationships, and kind of testing the waters of how this person is going to respond to us sharing ourselves in this way. But I think it can also be true for pre-existing relationships if there's like territory that we haven't been into before, and we want to like take a risk to go into that territory, and can we trust the person to hold us in that territory? So that's kind of from this side of like taking the risk to develop the trust. On the other side, to like test out if there's trust before taking the risk, I think there's some really kind of simple things that we can do. One in particular is just before sharing ourselves vulnerably, actually setting some kind of context that we're going to be doing that. And it can be as simple as saying, hey, I feel quite vulnerable to share this, or I feel a bit scared that I'm going to be judged in the thing that I'm about to share. Or it could be that we like make some kind of request. Hey, like I'm about to share this thing about myself and I don't really want to be fixed or given advice around it. Are you able to just hear me and maybe even just like reflect what you heard me say? So we can make a request of somebody. We might have a conversation about the conversation that we want to have. So before we even have the kind of more vulnerable conversation, it might lead to like a, hey, I've got this thing that I want to share, I have a judgment and it feels really vulnerable to share the judgment, and I feel concerned that it might be triggering for you somehow. And how are you feeling right now? Do you feel like you're able to actually receive this? And it might have us having a conversation around that. Or, there's all kinds of possible conversations we could have around these types of requests before we actually share the thing vulnerably. The final thought I have here is that the more that we can trust that we know what to do if our vulnerability doesn't land well, then the safer we feel to be able to take a risk as well. So if I share something and maybe the person gets triggered around what I'm sharing, and then they kind of react in some kind of way, and maybe I'll get hurt in response to this. So this happened to me today. I took a risk to share like a bit of a judgment that I had, and and what came back at me then felt a bit triggering to me. So at some point it was just like too much for me, and I basically said that, hey, I want to stop talking about this right now. I don't feel like I'm able to like stay in this conversation. I feel a bit triggered. So to trust that I can actually pull back from the conversation if I need to, or slow it down. I've done that quite a lot too, where I might say, wow, I'm noticing that I'm feeling a lot of sensation, and I just want to pause for a second, just like take a few deep breaths and just like be with that sensation. So these kinds of things let me resource myself, or assert boundaries, or withdraw to protect myself, and maybe have a bit more time to digest what was going on for me before re-engaging the conversation. Or maybe it's even just sharing impact, like, wow, hearing that, I feel quite hurt, and in the sharing of that, it's likely to have the other person be able to kind of know where I'm at, and such that they can have a bit of compassion for what's going on for me. And of course this goes in the other direction too. Like, the more that I can be aware of another person and their vulnerability, I can kind of help, calibrate to what's going to have them feel safe to share themselves vulnerably. So if any of these things essentially give me a more sense of trust that I know how to kind of clean up if something in the sharing of my vulnerability has gone wrong somehow. So all of these things have been really, really helpful for me. Being able to bring my vulnerability out into the world more, and also hold it for others. And I do think kind of it's in all of these things that where the skillful means of bringing our vulnerability, and then all the kind of beauty that kind of comes out of that resides. So I hope there's some useful strategies in what I've shared here. And I'd love to hear if there's any kind of specific examples or strategies that you use as well. Thank you.